Hello, and welcome to my Ecology in Your Life project. My project centered on avian behavior. So this is my table of contents. So let's start by introducing my project. The questions that I wanted to target in my project. Firstly, start with ecological, broad. Does human activity affect the behavior of avian species? Now, to specify that, to form it into a research question, what I wanted to target was to what extent does the level of human activity in high or low traffic areas affect the flight initiation distance of birds in urban and park environments? So the flight initiation distance is basically the distance between the human and the bird, which triggers the bird. It's like the threshold on which the bird will take off from the ground and escape. This I picked because it's a very easily measurable variable, and you can clearly tell whether the bird's flying or not, and it also is a good indicator of bird behavior, and it's an indicator for other ecological concepts, which I will discuss in a few minutes. So the research areas I chose were UBC Vancouver campus and Stanley Park. I chose UBC Vancouver campus as the high human traffic area, and Stanley Park. I was not able to find statistics about average foot traffic, average vehicle traffic, average human activity in general for either area, but I did try. However, I think it's pretty reasonable to estimate that there would be a significant difference, possibly, between the two. There will be limitations, but I will discuss that later. But I essentially chose Stanley Park as the low activity and the UBC Vancouver campus as the high activity. So on to the possible birds which I will observe. On UBC campus, the most abundant ones are robins, thrush, sparrow, juncos, and chickadees. And then at Stanley Park, there's chickadees again, more chickadees, gulls, golden eyes, and ducks. And the species richness is significant. There's a difference about 100 species between UBC Vancouver and Stanley Park. However, there's going to be a lot of overlap between species that are in Stanley Park as well as Vancouver campus. So the ecological concepts that I wanted to target with this project. So the core concepts, firstly, is risk tolerance. So birds, they have a decision to make as the human is approaching them. As human activity is increasing, they have a decision to make about whether to expend the energy to take off and take flight, or to seek safety, or to conserve energy. This is important for their behavior to study, as well as urban ecology, how these birds interact and utilize human structures to shape their behavior rather than what they would use in forest and park settings. Additionally, behavioral plasticity, how their behavior changes and adapts based on the conditions around them, and how urban ecology plays into that, as well as human activity, whether birds seek to be more bold, more synchronized with human activity, what have you. Additionally, habituation is a concept where they become more accustomed to the conditions, whether it's more food or less food, depending on if there's human activity there or not, as well as predator-prey dynamics, where this plays in exactly the same, where birds may stop or more increasingly view humans as predators, probably not as prey, but maybe small children. Also, minor influences. Adaptation, natural selection, and microevolution are not things that I can study with the resources that I have, but it's definitely things that have played a role. So obviously, adaptation and natural selection, where birds that adapt to human activity and seek out human sources of food and nutrition and resources will probably survive more, as well as natural selection. Those birds that know how to conserve energy in urban environments better will probably survive more. And also microevolution, especially more birds that have bold traits. I'm not sure if that's a genetic trait, but if it's a practice that gets passed down through parenting and through child rearing, this will be rewarded if they're more bold to seek out human resources, as well as energy trade-offs are something to pay attention to, where bird behavior and their relationship to flight initiation based on their level of threat perception. So let's go over the procedure. I chose a very rudimentary way of collecting my data. The first step was spotting the bird, and this would usually be a pack of birds. Most often they came in groups, and I would spot the individual one and keep eye on which one I wanted so I wouldn't get mixed up. I would then pull out my measuring tape and approach in a controlled unidirectional approach where I wasn't doing any variable movements or anything like that. And the moment that the bird took off from the ground and took flight, I would stop in my tracks, anchor my measuring tape in the ground, and then walk it over to where the bird had taken off. I would then initial the data down. I would take an estimate or count how many of the same bird species there were, the region upon which it was, the time of day, the date, and then later when I was home and reviewing, I often took pictures of the birds, and then I would see which species that was. So let's have a look at the raw data. Variables I chose, obviously entry number, location, this was either Stanley Park or UBC Vancouver, the region of the of Stanley Park or Vancouver. I chose significant buildings or labeled things that I could find, entrances, paths, monuments, or designated areas, the date, the time, the species. I did my best with species identification. The website eBird for Vancouver helped me significantly to identify which birds it was. I'm not a bird watcher, but I did my best, and some of them might be incorrect. The group size, often they were less than 10, so I could count how many there were. However, with large packs of birds, like especially the European starling, there was just like 30 of them. Like I would just have to estimate and I would lose track of my count. As well, in the last variable, the dependent variable, which I chose, was the flight initiation distance. Distance between the index of my foot, the tippy toe of my foot, to the spot where the bird took off. And this I estimated to 10 centimeters because there's a lot of, I'm keeping an eye on where I don't really have like an exact idea of where they took off, and I don't have an exact idea where my foot was, so I just gave an error bar of plus or minus 10 centimeters. So this is data set 2 for Stanley Park again, and UBC. Overall, my data collection took about the span of 5 or 6 days, 5 or 6 days it took to get all my data in place. A lot of time was spent looking at eBird and trying to discover which bird species it was. But oftentimes it was just the most abundant species I was finding. I wasn't finding any rare species often. So the analyzed results, we found a minimum, which I thought was very significant, 0.3 meters away. So that was clearly a very accustomed individual, or maybe just due to their species, I'm not sure. A maximum of 210 centimeters, 2 meters, we're maybe just very unaccustomed to human activity. But mind you, all this data is taken within the city of Vancouver, so all these birds have encountered humans at some point. A limitation for later. Median of 70, mode of 70 and 80, mean of 85.5 across both data sets, a range of 180, standard deviation across both data sets of 46.6, and an interquartile range of the inner 50% of data points of 30. So these are all our statistics. Now, to discover if they were significant, I undertook a basic statistical approach using RStudio, and basic calculator software found online. So the mean of the UBC flight initiation distance was 76 centimeters, and the mean of the Stanley Park flight initiation distance was 95 centimeters. This was a difference of 19 centimeters. To determine if they were significant, we had 20 trials. I found a t-value of difference of negative 1.28 for test statistics and a p-value of 0.207. So this p-value is obviously less than this traditional 0.05, 95% assurance that is statistically significant. So the difference is not statistically significant. So the findings, it's not statistically significant, a little bit of a waste of a time, but I will get into that right now with limitations. So when I undertook this study, I was definitely way in over my head. I didn't account for a lot of differences. When I initially thought of it, I thought there'd be like way major differences between the birds in the forest of Stanley Park and birds on Main Mall. But there was so much noise in the data when I even tried to put it into a line graph and bar graphs and scatter plots. It was useless. It wasn't worth putting the graphs and the visualizations on the presentation. First limitation was species behavior. Not controlling for species was the biggest problem. Obviously, different species are going to work differently because they've evolved in different ways within these micro habitats and micro populations. Obviously, everyone knows that seagulls and pigeons are so adapted to human environments, and I could say the same for chickadees. I found that they were very, bold with their activity in human areas. The second was location size. I thought that birds had a massive range, and with further research, I realized that these individual bird species often stuck to one corner of campus, one corner of Stanley Park, small little regions, and it really added a lot of noise to the data when I included all of them, like birds from the north of UBC campus to the south of UBC campus. They obviously act very differently because of the variable human activity between those two locations. Another thing was group conduct. These birds were found in different numbers of groups, which definitely would have played into how they acted and behaved towards me, perceiving me as a predator or not. And they might be more bold with a group or less bold with a group based on, other members' behavior. Additionally, time of day. I didn't get exposed to as many bird species as I would have if I had done it at different times of the day, different days in the month, things like that. Breeding status played a big role. Well, not a big role, just a funny role that I'll get into later. But obviously that would impact their behavior significantly. And this was not a long-term study. This is over the course of a week, right? So not much variation in that. There's not much standardization in that. The colors I wore might have been a minor thing, but obviously I think I saw a little bit of research. I didn't cite anything, but I did a little bit of quick research, and I realized that wearing colors obviously portrays you as differently to different birds based on their sight perception and whether they viewed me as a threat or not. So some days I wore red, some days I wore blue, black, white, so that might have altered their perception of me. The landscape, I found that birds that were in open areas a lot often took off a lot quicker, but that's just anecdotally. I don't have statistical evidence of that, but I found that, and I found that birds in more shrubbery environments, forested environments, took off later because they had better options to climb up a tree or hide in a bush or something like that. The weather obviously played a role. Sometimes I went out when it was sprinkling. I never went out when it was pouring rain, which is another problem because it's not a whole data set. But definitely the bird's behavior change because it adds more energy. If there's water in the air, they're taking on water and stuff like that. It takes more energy, so their energy and safety trade-off is definitely going to be different. Also the presence of other animals. There might be predators or helpful animals in the presence of them, so that would have changed their behavior significantly. The approach direction, I didn't have a clear circumference around every single one of the birds. Sometimes there was corners, sometimes there was buildings in the way. So I didn't get to always approach the bird from the front or from behind, and this probably would have changed the behavior of, if I was too close to the bird. When it became aware of me, probably influenced whether it was shocked, surprised, and influenced its flight initiation, as well as the season. So obviously birds are all different walks of life, and they are going through different processes at this time. This was not a long-term study, so I had birds that were coming off of migration patterns, that were in breeding cycles, that were in resting cycles, things like that. So that was definitely a limitation in the study. So you can see there's a lot of noise to the data, and definitely explains why there was no statistical significance. So let's apply those ecological concepts that I mentioned before. These will not be, how should you say? These aren't based on any statistics that I learned from my data collection. I'm just going to base them off my own anecdotal experience. So risk tolerance, I found that there was very little difference between birds on UBC campus and in Stanley Park. There's very little difference. Urban ecology, however, I found repeatedly birds on UBC campus actually didn't utilize buildings. Maybe that's because the shape of the building aren't friendly to birds. They're boxes and stuff like that. And there's also a bunch of anti-bird, like the spikes on a lot of the roofs and shelves and stuff like that. But I found that the birds on UBC campus still utilize shrubs and trees and general distance and fields and stuff like that to protect themselves rather than the urban environment around them. I didn't see a lot of overusage of human structures for their benefit. Behavioral plasticity, I didn't observe this that much because I didn't observe an individual bird in both environments to see how their behavior changed. Obviously, I don't have the resources to track individual birds. Habituation, I definitely 100% found that the birds on UBC campus were much more accustomed, especially, I forget the name of the park, but it's around the IRC building. And that environment for birds, there's so much human activity going on that they're so accustomed. That is where I found 30 centimeters, 40 centimeters, 50 centimeters, very close distances where the birds will tolerate me being there. As well as I saw another difference where I think that a lot of the birds in the forests of Stanley Park saw me as predator and a threat much more than they did on UBC campus, where they just saw me as another animal that posed no threat to them. Maybe even a resource for food, especially those birds that hang out outside Tim Hortons and Walter Gage and stuff like that. So the minor variables like adaptation, natural selection, microevolution, I wasn't able to study those. I'm not doing a long-term study. I wasn't able to study individuals from birth and death rates and seeing which birds with different traits survived. But the energy trade-offs, I definitely felt like the birds on UBC campus at least took a lot more time to take off. So I would walk towards them and then they would walk. And then I would walk towards them and then they would walk. And I felt like they would do that stalling a bit more before they took that energy consumption to take off than in Stanley Park. Ethical considerations. This project does have some ethics to consider. I did scare 40 birds for this data collection. I'm not sure if that's an ethical consideration, but just to throw it out there, I did observe the birds for 1 or 2 minutes afterwards while I was noting the time, the date, the amount of other birds, and none of them fell prey to predation. I'm just saying that none of them sustained injuries to what I saw. I didn't see any animal death or anything like that because of my procedure. Additionally, the environmental impacts. I only utilized my phone and the measuring tape. I wasn't invasive into any protected areas or anything like that. I didn't use any trash or disposable or non-disposable things. I was conscious of my impact on the environment. Eagle escapades, geese games, and heron hijinks. So these birds are massive birds, and it's kind of what got me started thinking about doing this project in the first place. I live at Walter Gage Residence at the very top floor, and across from my view, there's a cell phone tower on top of another apartment building, and I see two bald eagles and chickadees there. I'm not sure what other bird is up there, but they're always up there on that, competing for that space. But sometimes workers come out, and the chickadees are always comfortable while the workers are out working on the roof, repairing whatever cell stuff is on there. But the bald eagles always go away, and they find some other, or they just circle in the air waiting for the workers to go away. So that's what got me thinking. But I wasn't able to interact with any of these. So the eagles, I wasn't able to gain. They perch on top of high buildings and high trees. I wasn't able to access them. Another problem with this data collection and limitation, which I didn't include, was a lot of these species I just wasn't able to observe because I'm not able to climb trees or anything like that to get this data, because of my rudimentary procedure. The geese as well, I was terrified of getting pecked to death, so I did not engage with them. And the herons were out. I went to Wreck Beach and Tower Beach a couple times, and they were out in the water, and I wasn't able to anchor my measuring tape, and I didn't have my friends at that time to help me measure their initiation. And also I didn't like going in the water that much, but I tried once. Yeah. Basically, this slide is just here to show you that I had a very limited data sample from what I could observe with my resources. So for future research, a lot of improvements could be made from a smaller scope, looking at individual species, smaller locations, smaller regions within these, and different locations. I think using areas where you have access to human traffic and human activity data would be important, and you could get a much more significant difference in their behavior if you compared, say, UBC campus birds to birds up in northern BC, right? Maybe you can find some of the same species and control for that. I think that'd be much better, as well as long-term study. So you need to control for seasons, you need to control for how these birds are acting at a given time, because that definitely affected it. Like, the geese weren't mating, but if they were, then that definitely would have affected their behavior towards humans, because they wouldn't even have taken off. They would have fought back against the humans. So you need to take that into account and how these other birds act as well. The last thing is possibly lab tested. Maybe birds raised in captivity could offer interesting results for a study like this. And maybe here is my works cited. And yeah, I just want to say this was a great experience, and I liked studying this ecology, and I definitely liked applying the different things I was learning in class, especially things like species interactions and species requirements, when I was considering why species were in certain areas and not. So thank you for watching.